So hello, everyone, and welcome to the 2025 New Mexico Federal Lands Access Program webinar for prospective applicants. Just a quick intro from me. My name's Andrew Valdez, and I'm a planner with Federal Highways. But I did spend many years in local government and did submit a number of successful and some unsuccessful FLAP applications. So, I've been in your shoes. I'm here to help you, through the process. Just a few housekeeping items before we hop in here. The quick disclaimer, this meeting is being recorded and it will be posted on the New Mexico FLAP webpage. Secondly, this webinar is geared mostly for the state and local government agencies. So since you all own and manage the facilities where FLAP dollars are invested, that means it falls on you to lead the application process. And we'll kind of get into the details of all that later in the presentation. Yesterday, we did host a webinar for the Federal Land Management Agencies, or FLMAs, in New Mexico. And we had pretty good attendance. So some of you may start to hear from folks on the FLMA side about potential projects. We slotted a couple of hours for today. I've got about 45 slides to go through. So the presentation itself is probably going to run maybe about an hour, and then we'll have plenty of time for Q&A after I'm done. And also just note that all the application materials have been posted to the New Mexico FLAP webpage since about the beginning of the month. So those are all ready for download. For those of you that might not be familiar with the Access Program webpage, we'll also go into that a little bit later in the presentation. And then finally, I did add this slide deck to the meeting invite, and it'll also be posted on the FLAP webpage. But if you have any trouble or you can't find it, just let me know, and I can shoot you a copy. Okie dokes. So here's our general outline for today. This may be review for some of you, but for others, this could be, brand new information. So I'm going to cover federal lands, highways, and the FLAP program, basically A to Z. And then we'll get into the elements of the application packet itself and the application process. And we'll close out with the call timeline, some general housekeeping, and we'll have plenty of time at the end for Q&A. There are also some key points to look out for that you'll see with that little yellow notification there. Right, so federal lands, highways. Basically, we are the Department of Transportation for the federal land management agencies. So as I'm sure lots of you know, there in New Mexico, about a third of the United States is owned and managed by the federal government. And our office plans, designs, and builds transportation infrastructure within and leading to federal land units. And we have different programs for each, and I'll talk about that in just a minute here. We do function much like a state DOT in that we deliver most of our projects, although we don't actually own or maintain any transportation assets. The rest of federal highways is under what's called the federal aid system, where funding goes to the individual states, and federal highways plays more of a stewardship and oversight role with the state DOTs and other local agencies. So for federal lands highways, we try to capture that in our mission statement here. Building effective, efficient, and reliable networks of federal public roads and bridges to protect and enhance the nation's natural resources and provide needed transportation access for Native Americans. And providing financial resources, transportation engineering assistance, public roads that service the transportation needs of federal and Indian lands. And just to give you guys sort of an order of magnitude, and we'll talk funding a little bit later, but the federal aid system is much bigger than the federal lands system dollar-wise. And this is where Central Federal Lands, my office, sits within the larger department. So we're a division office of Federal Lands Highways, and you can see the Land Management Agency logos there. And this map just shows the Central Federal Land states. So our division office is in Lakewood. This is where I'm based out of. And our territory includes California to North Dakota to Texas and everything in between, including New Mexico, which is why we're talking to you guys today. These are our core capital programs. So today we're mostly going to be talking about the Federal Lands Access Program, or FLAP, and the Federal Lands Transportation Program, or FLTP, and how those are supposed to sort of work symbiotically together. These two programs were set up to address access to and within federal lands. And sort of in an ideal world, these programs complement and support each other, and we'll get into that angle a little bit later. But the easiest way to think about this is FLTP is for federally owned systems, so owned by the FLMAs, and FLAP is non-federally owned, but provides access to public federal lands. FLAP projects are programmed through a call for projects, which we opened for New Mexico on April 7th. And the owner of the facility or the agency that maintains the facility has to be the primary applicant. So typically this is like a state DOT or other local government agency. So like the folks on this call representing counties and towns. But the ownership must either be non-federal, or the local agency must agree to assume maintenance responsibility in the case of an FLTP route, like a forest highway or something like that. And we'll get into all that eligibility a little bit later in the presentation. The FLTP is programmed by the FLMAs themselves, and we don't actually have much visibility into that process. We just deliver the projects for them. And we also have programs for U.S. federally recognized tribes and emergency federal relief. It's the TTP and the ERFO you see at the bottom there, but we're not going to spend much time talking about those today. Just a little bit more about Central. We have those 14 western states I showed you on the map, and some Pacific territories, including Hawaii. And we're not just about moving people from A to B. Our federal lands are some of the nation's treasures, and the built infrastructure needs to take into account things like visitor experience and resource conservation, view sheds, things like that. And our office really is at the forefront of delivering context-sensitive projects like that. Federal lands, highways, roads serve recreational travel and tourism, protect and enhance natural resources, provide sustained economic development in rural areas, and provide needed transportation access for Native Americans. So overall, we provide funding for more than 90,000 miles of federally owned and public authority owned roads, which serve federal lands. Central sort of, or federal lands highways, fills a niche in the transportation infrastructure and development ecosystem. Since our projects tend to be very unique, and we have a deep bench both among our staff and the contractors we work with in project delivery and business operations. So the specialties you can kind of see listed there on the slide. So from long range planning to right of way and utilities, environmental clearance, project management, all the way through closeout, cradle to grave, we do it all. We are a strong project manager centric organization. So if you are selected for a project, there'll just be a single point of contact assigned in the PM, and you don't have to navigate a complex federal bureaucracy to get information or manage contingencies. We do operate under performance metrics. So first off, we are project funded. So we really are incentivized to service the client and get those funds out the door and investment on the ground. We aim to obligate over 95% of program funds on a yearly basis so that we're not carrying anything over year to year. And we want to see over 75% of those dollars going towards projects and not going towards administration and overhead. And even though we do have a number of architecture and engineering firms on contract, we do try to deliver a majority of the work in-house, and this keeps our staff trained and up to date. And as part of project closeout, we also send out satisfaction surveys. And there we also shoot for 85% and above. Okay, so moving on to the access program. So this is a program that's authorized by Congress in national transportation legislation, first in MAP 21, which is back in 2012, and it's been continued through every transportation bill through the current one, which is the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, or bill. You may have also heard of the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. It's the same thing, just different name, different acronym. Bill authorized around $300 million per year for FLAP from 2022, and it expires at the end of fiscal year 2026. And we expect and hope that Congress would reauthorize FLAP in the next transportation bill. And its purpose or stated goals are to improve non-federal transportation facilities that provide access to, are adjacent to, or sometimes located within federal lands, with an emphasis on high-use recreation sites and federal economic generators. And I'll kind of unpack that a little bit more later. So we'll start with basic eligibility. Per the legislation, any public highway, road, bridge, trail, or trailhead or transit system located on or adjacent to federal lands is eligible. This includes activities such as rehabilitation, restoration, construction, reconstruction, engineering and environmental compliance, operation and maintenance of transit facilities, and planning and research. But title and or maintenance responsibility must be vested with state, county, or local or tribal government. So the non-federal facility owner will be the primary applicant, as I said earlier. Or if it's a federally owned FLMA route, it can be eligible if the local agency consents to maintain the facility through a formal agreement. And we can provide examples of those kinds of agreements if needed. There were some changes to FLAP under bill, the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law. There used to be a match requirement, and now local match is optional, but it can help in certain situations, which I'll talk about in different scenarios. And there's expanded eligibility for what are called context-sensitive solutions. These are projects that preserve scenic, aesthetic, historic, or environmental resources. So think of like a raised boardwalk over a wetland, or an aquatic organism passage over a stream, for example. And there's also now expanded eligibility for signage, wayfinding, landscaping, and other visual mitigations. Typically, those elements by themselves won't be competitive in a FLAP project. We typically want to see the primary component of the project be a transportation facility that expands access to people, but now they can be included in a larger project package. Here I'll run through some common eligibility scenarios. So at the top there, we've got a road or trail that starts outside the federal lands and ends inside the federal lands, assuming the blue segment is federally owned and the red segment is locally owned. That whole alignment would be eligible with a maintenance agreement or easement when the local agency agrees to maintain that blue segment of roadway or trail. Second one down is kind of the most straightforward scenario. You've got a locally owned road, starts outside the federal lands and ends at a federal land boundary, like a trailhead or parking lot or fee station. If the trailhead or parking lot is locally owned and maintained, all of those facilities would be eligible for FLAP investment in an application. And then there at the bottom, you can have a road or facility that starts outside the federal lands and short of the unit boundary. That would also be eligible. Typically, we don't want to do anything that's further than like 10 miles from a fedland boundary or entrance. But if it leads to or provides some access to federal lands, it is eligible. And, you know, just note that the further away a project is from a fedland boundary or access portal, the less competitive it's likely to be. Few notes here: tribal roads maintained by a local tribe are eligible, but the facility must access federal lands other than tribal. So in this program, tribal lands are not eligible federal lands as the destination for this program. So tribal entities are sort of more treated like a DOT or a county than an FLMA. And then finally, land leased by the federal government is not eligible. It must be federally owned. This is another scenario that we see sometimes and might be relevant in New Mexico. You can have a state park that surrounds a reservoir that's federally managed by like the Army Corps of Engineers or the Bureau of Reclamation. Roads or even water facilities like docks or marinas leading to the water that are within the park that are not federally maintained are eligible. And that's another opportunity for leveraged funds perhaps to be proposed in an application. So say if like the state park is already planning some transportation improvements to the site, all of those improvements could be bundled into one application for either us to deliver or the state park could just request FLAP funds and then use those to supplement the project they're already delivering. So that's eligibility. Moving on to funding. So FLAP funding is allocated by a legislative formula, and this formula hasn't changed since MAP 21. Essentially, it's a function of the percentage of federal lands within a state and federal public roadway mileage by state. And so this is how funding shakes out on a national basis. Sort of unsurprisingly, Western states are favored in this program. New Mexico is one of our bigger programs with about 34% of federal landmass, and that gives you an annual allocation of about $8 million a year. Frankly, that's not a ton of money in the transportation world. And of course, I wish we had more. But if we're talking things like unpaved roads, trails, natural surface trailheads, planning projects, and leveraged opportunities with partners, that funding can start to go a little farther. And keep in mind that we will typically program anywhere from 2 to 4 years of funding in any one call. So we could be talking up to $30 million worth of projects in this call. The bipartisan infrastructure law did remove the local match requirement, but this is what the local requirement used to be for matching funds. So in previous years, New Mexico applicants had to come up with about a 14% local match. This does help lower the barrier to entry for some less well-resourced local agencies, but of course also puts pressure on our limited program dollars. There are instances where it does make sense for a local or state agency to want to partly or mostly fund a project with either federal aid or other local funds, and then just use FLAP as a supplementary funding source, and then CFL could deliver the project. That's not uncommon, and of course helps us expand the program in any one state. I'll talk about this a little bit more later, but generally if you've got a road where say half of the traffic is accessing the federal lands, the rest of the usage is either local or through traffic, we would want to see commensurate local funding proposed in the project application. And we got here, this is just a rundown of eligible leverage funding sources. So a cash match with federal aid or other local general funds is kind of the most straightforward. FLTP projects can also count as leveraged funds. And again, FLTP is a program for federally owned transportation assets. I did flag this for the FLMAs yesterday, but if there's an FLTP project and the need actually extends beyond the federal boundaries, it would make sense to bundle those projects into one package for us to design and deliver. There's significant savings when we can do projects like that. And there's a place to indicate that in the application, which I'll point out. Unlike other federal grants, we can match FLAP funds with other federal discretionary sources. So FLAP is kind of unique that way. Sometimes FLAP can be used to supplement funds that have maybe already been awarded in a larger grant program, like build or infra. And that may even improve the scoring on application as it would lower the risk profile of a project. So that's something to keep in mind. We also work with applicants to develop a payment program that's flexible. So for example, if a county is contributing general fund dollars on a project, they don't need to have all those funds up front. And we can do that through a reimbursable agreement and a payment schedule. Just to note, we can't receive private or nonprofit funding directly, but a county could say, set up an MOU with a nonprofit, and then essentially be the pass-through mechanism to fund a leveraged fund FLAP opportunity. Here's a little more on the FLAP, FLTP leverage angle. As I said, these two programs can be bundled, and we do like to see that. There are a few conditions. The Programming Decisions Committee, or PDC, and FLMA concur on the project, and I'll talk a little bit more about the PDC later. The projects need to be contiguous or at least adjacent to each other. And then the project has to be managed as one delivery package so that we can realize those economies of scale. And sometimes the PDC may also require the local agency to contribute some funding, but this is sort of figured out on a case-by-case basis. And here's just a graphic example of how a joint FLTP, FLAP project could work. So say we've got $1 million FLAP project to improve a county road to the entrance of a national forest, shown there in blue. And then separately, there's an FLTP project to improve the scenic drive to the parking area, the segment there in red. Those projects could be combined in a FLAP application, and really this has benefits to all the parties. The applicant has, a low or no cost burden, and they can have us design and deliver the whole project. They get to claim leverage funds on the application. This is also great for us and the taxpayer because it'll be much cheaper to deliver one larger project than to try to mobilize for two smaller projects separated by a period of years. And again, I made the FLMAs aware of this possibility since they are the ones that know more about the programming of the FLTP. So hopefully there's some projects like this in the pipeline that line up with needs on the local access system. On project delivery, so as I mentioned earlier, CFL typically leads and delivers the selected projects, and there's a place in the application to indicate this, and I'll point that out when we go through the application later. That's because this is our business model. We are project funded, and we do have those performance metrics that we have to meet. There are some exceptions to this, like major highways, bridge repairs, or transit projects, but they are somewhat rare. If a state or local agency does want to deliver the project, we do allow that. There are some guidelines. There should be a justification for it. So for example, if the state DOT is already underway with a project and they're looking for supplemental funds, those could be provided by FLAP. If the Federal Highways State Division Office and state DOT would have stewardship and oversight responsibilities. So there's some reporting that typically goes along with that. And then the FLAP funds are typically a fixed set amount or capped. So the PDC will say FLAP can contribute up to X dollars, and then it's up to the project lead agency to make that amount work for their project. All right, so who makes the programming funding decisions? Each state has a Programming Decisions Committee, or PDC. This is a 3-person volunteer board that's established by a charter and made up of a state DOT rep, a local government rep, and then our office, Fed Highways, has 1 seat. You can see the PDC responsibilities there, but essentially it's their task to ensure proper stewardship of the program funds from a statewide perspective. It's not their job to advocate for special projects in their districts or anything like that. Now, what you don't see here is FLMA representation on the PDC. Each state has an FLMA Technical Advisory Group, or TAG. These are typically FLMA reps from the regional or national levels, and they advise the PDC, but they don't have a vote on the board. We give the asset owners, in this case, the state and local governments, the final say, but feedback from the tags is important, so FLMAs do play a role in deliberations. Okay, so moving on to preferred projects. So preference is given to transportation facilities, providing access to high-use recreation sites and federal economic generators. That's actually written into the legislation. Federal recreation is defined as any site used by the public to recreate on federal lands. Pretty straightforward there. High use is defined for a region or local area and not compared across the entire state or across the entire country. So not every county is going to have the Grand Canyon, for example. And then federal economic generators are defined as any use of or on federal lands that increases aggregate investment or economic activity for a local community and or region. So think like a ski area or energy production sometimes, sites that have a regional or national draw, major employment centers, but the underlying ownership does have to be federal. And these are the kinds of projects that we like to see that make up a strong application. So we want to see typically full reconstruction or rehabilitation of a roadway, anything that expands modal access to a federal unit. So think like a new bike lane or a new multi-use path, wholesale bridge replacements, safety enhancements. Those are all good. Things like access portals, trailheads, and parking lot improvements are also good projects because they expand or enhance access. Obviously, a lot of this is a judgment call, but if we see a reasonable scope, realistic project estimate, and good FLMA coordination and support, the project will meet the FLAP vision, and that's going to typically be a strong project. We also love to see partnerships. Partnerships really are what make excellent projects. When multiple agencies work together on an application, this can help leverage funds or local knowledge and addresses projects of mutual interest and greatest need. And sometimes many, complicated projects require a coalition of local champions to get them moving and funded. So the more partners at the table, typically the more resilient a project is going to be. And just to keep in mind, really our only goal is to service the partners and deliver quality projects that the public and agencies want. We're sort of a neutral third party here, trying to deliver the best projects. Moving on to weak applications. Typically, we don't like to do maintenance-only projects. The purpose of the program is to expand access, not patch up something that has an underlying major flaw or to address a county's deferred maintenance backlog. We also want to do complete projects. We wouldn't want to do, a project where an underlying issue or problem isn't addressed. So say like a road has an outdated design or poor subgrade, and if those elements aren't addressed in the application, that could weaken the overall project. Obviously, unclear, poorly written applications don't fare well. Pictures are always great, or graphic examples, so photos, maps, whatever context you can provide to clearly communicate the purpose and need of the project is helpful. We also have a section to add a link to a video file or recorded YouTube video. These are helpful in assessing applications, but that's an optional piece. And then, of course, the project must meet the basic criteria. We always want to see good coordination with the FLMAs. Believe it or not, we do sometimes get applications where there was no communication or coordination between the locals and the FLMAs. Sometimes we see applications that seem more like urban or rural commuter routes or neighborhood streets, and the Fedlands component is, say, a secondary or a minority of traffic counts. Those kinds of projects can be eligible, but in cases like those, we would want to see commensurate local funds since the Fedlands access component is secondary to another purpose. Okay, so now we're going to talk about the application and the application process. The links you see at the top of the slide there will take you to the main FLAP landing page and to the New Mexico page. And there you see a map of the US and other info about the access program. As you can see, New Mexico is currently green, which means the process is open and we're accepting applications. Generally, a call for projects is open anywhere from 70 to 90 days. And we try to schedule calls every 3 to 4 years, depending on funding availability. and our resource availability and other projects that we're doing in the state. And the reason we do it this way instead of a yearly call is because we don't want the size of a state's allocation to drive our programming decisions. We would rather develop a quality multi-year program, and we don't want to constrain ourselves to an artificial yearly number. So if you click on New Mexico, this is what the state's page looks like. And this is where the application and call timeline is. I'll also post any updates here. So while the call for projects is open, I'd suggest bookmarking this page. Information about your local PDC members is also here in case you got a question for one of them. And I'll also post the slide deck and video recording of today's webinar here. And just so you don't miss it, these are the hyperlinks to download the application materials. Okay, so hopping into the application. We've tried to make the forms as straightforward and self-explanatory as possible. And the application PDFs, I've provided a lot of sample text to try and give you a sense of what we're looking for with each question. Make sure to take the sample text out and put in your text, or leave it empty if the item doesn't apply to your project. We're not going to go line by line. I'm just going to point out kind of the key elements of the application itself. And then if you have any questions, of course, I'm available to follow up with offline. The whole application packet's only 7 pages long, and then there are a couple of 1-page supplementals, so it's really not too onerous. So the first few pages here are just background data on you as the applicant and project, agency with ownership and maintenance responsibility, project length and other data points like traffic counts. If you don't have exact numbers from counters, estimates are better than nothing. Field 6 is where you would attach a bridge inspection report if your project contains a bridge. Field 8 is really important. This is where you would estimate or provide data about those traffic counts and the percentage of daily traffic accessing the federal lands. Again, if you have counter data or state DOT data, that's great. But if you don't, I would say go ahead and estimate. This is one of the critical pieces we look at in evaluating the applications. And, you know, we rely on the locals to know a little bit better than what we know here in Lakewood. Field 9 is where you'll get into crash data. Again, it's okay if you don't have exact numbers. You can provide anecdotal information here. And then field 10 is where you could indicate if there's an FLTP project in proximity. So, you know, reach out, have the conversations with the local rangers or park superintendents to see if there are any of these in the area. And again, this is something we made the FLMAs aware of yesterday. Page 3 of the application gets into information about the proposed project. So this is where you can explain the purpose and need and alignment with the FLAP program. This is also where you can provide a detailed description of the proposed work, including if the project can be phased. Phasing is an important one because maybe we can fund part of a project, but not the whole thing. So it helps us to know what's the most critical piece priority-wise. Page 4 is right-of-way, utility, and environmental considerations. Again, it's okay if you don't have all this information when you submit. If we get to the point of sending a scoping engineer, they will flesh out all of these details during a scoping visit. But if you do have this information about right-of-way and utilities, those are helpful for us. And you know, your local public works or roads department or state DOT can typically help with these. This is also where you'll indicate the proposed lead agency there in field 10. Again, typically this will be Central Federal Lands unless there's a compelling reason for another agency to assume the project. All right, page 5 is project cost estimation and funding sources. So this part is really just for us to get a rough order of magnitude cost. We're not trying to get down to the penny estimates. And we provided a cost estimation Excel workbook in the application materials for you to download. These are a little technical. So if you have a roadway engineer on staff that can help you out, that can be good. You can also use your own estimating tools and workbooks. You don't have to use ours. In general, I'd say it's better to overestimate cost than underestimate cost. And this is also where you'll indicate any leveraged funds or non-flat funds. And there's a text box at the bottom of the page to describe that in narrative. And this is also where you'll mention if there's an FLTP project in the vicinity. This is what the cost estimate templates look like. Again, it's an Excel workbook, and we have different tabs for different kinds of projects. So there's one for paved road, there's one for gravel road, one for multi-use path, parking lot, etc. And we've tried to pre-populate these spreadsheets with formulas. So whoever's doing this estimation for you will just be entering quantities, and then you would get an output of total project cost at the bottom there, and you'll put that in the total page, in the total in page 5 of the application here. So that line item 22 at the top. Okay, so evaluation criteria. It's up to the PDC to set the exact evaluation criteria and the weighting of these categories, but there will be some configuration of these 9 elements here. Some of these are sort of a binary yes, no, and then some are scored on a points basis. These are all pretty straightforward, but we'll just run through them really quick. We've got federal lands access. So this is kind of like proximity and significance to the FLMA. Again, closer to the federal lands, the better. High use recreation or federal economic generator. Public access. Safety improvement. Preservation. And this one is about sort of the asset management, state of good repair. Sustainability and environmental. Project cost and risk. Partnerships and coordination. And then finally, alignment with the FLAP program vision. So when you're filling out these applications, just keep these criteria in mind and speak to them as much as you can. We've also provided a non-construction worksheet for non-construction projects, so transit, planning, and research projects. So this is kind of less quantitative and more narrative-based. If you have a non-construction project, I'd say the best ones have a clear path to lead to future FLAP construction projects. So things like corridor plans or feasibility studies, where you know there's a need, but you aren't sure what the right project might be, or there needs to be some more process on a project and consensus building perhaps among the stakeholders. Those kinds of projects I think can do well in a non-construction type project. Transit is always kind of a tough one since FLAP is a one-time infusion of capital. It doesn't really make sense to stand up a whole transit operation with FLAP alone, since operations and maintenance costs, can be significant and are ongoing. But say if like an existing transit operator needs funding for some capital improvements or maybe acquisition of rolling stock or something like that, transit projects like those can fare better. This is just the endorsement form for the facility owner to fill out, just one page. But it's so we know that someone is on the hook for upkeep of the facility once it's been turned over. We wouldn't want to make an investment in a new road and then have the road be abandoned or be in limbo. And then similarly, this is the FLMA support form, also just one page, but it helps us see coordination and collaboration with the FLMA, between the FLMA and the local agencies. Again, we wouldn't want to fund a project that's not in alignment with the management objectives of the federal lands unit. Also a critical element of eligibility, so don't forget this one. And lastly, there's an instruction sheet and checklist. This is just to help you guys stay organized and make sure you didn't miss anything. This is also where you would paste a link to a video of the project. Again, this is optional, but these really do help the PDC in kind of getting to know your project, kind of a dashboard tour or something like that. And it kind of provides you an opportunity to sell and sort of market the project. So that's the application. Here's a general process if your project is selected. So if you do get shortlisted, you'll get a notification letter from us, and we'll set up some meetings to talk through any financial arrangements if leverage funds are being used. We also have an engagement letter that the project rep will sign. And then we'll work with you to set up a site visit for our scoping engineers to refine those cost estimates and make sure we're in the ballpark. Now, if the project still looks good, the PDC will place the project in our final program and work out a delivery schedule. And typically we'll take it from there and again, deliver the project cradle to grave. And again, that's right-of-way, utility, environmental clearances, design, construction, and closeout. Also important to note here that there's really no administrative burden on the applicant, as is the case with other federal grants. That's because FLAP isn't a grant program. It's a formulaic program, and the funding typically stays on the federal highway side, assuming we're delivering the project. So once a project is awarded, the applicant really doesn't have to go through any reporting or anything like that, unless someone else is delivering the project. And as I mentioned earlier, if someone else is delivering the project, there will be some oversight by the state DOT, and that can get a little more involved from the applicant's perspective. So here's our timeline for New Mexico. We'll have the call for projects open for about 70 days from April 7th to June 20th. We're targeting to have our deliberative process complete by late summer of this year. So we can have a short list meeting sometime in the August-September timeframe. And then we're giving ourselves sort of a generous amount of time to complete scoping, just because we'll have to work around winter weather. Scoping engineers need to be able to get eyes on the projects. But at the very least, I think we can expect to have scoping on shortlist projects complete by spring or summer of 26 next year. That would put a final programming meeting sometime in June of 26. And then that would give us construction of the selected projects sometime in the 28-29 timeframe. But a lot of that can kind of shift around and be project dependent. So none of this is really set in stone. And just kind of in closing, a few tips for success. Definitely want to reiterate now that FLMA coordination is crucial. You want to get the FLMAs sort of on board and make sure any proposed projects are in alignment with the way that they manage their units. Review the program guidance for eligibility. Again, I'm available to talk through eligibility, different projects with you, and if you've got an idea and you're not really sure about eligibility, we can see if there's a project in there. All the forms are just fillable PDF Adobe forms, but test them early, make sure that they work with your software and computer. Answer as many questions as possible. Again, some questions may not apply to you, and that's totally fine. But if it does apply to you, please provide some narrative and background. Review evaluation criteria. So those 9 criteria that we walked through earlier. Provide best data available. Again, hard data is always the best and preferred, but if it's not available, anecdotal information is better than nothing. And finally, those endorsement forms, you can also provide letters of support from friends groups or other stakeholders, nonprofits, things like that. Those can all be attached into the application, and those do help show support. And make sure you include that endorsement form for the facility owner and FLMA support forms. So that's really it for my presentation. Thanks everybody for your time, and I'm happy to hang on as long as needed to answer any questions. So thanks everybody.
Yeah, sorry, if I could just ask really quickly, where can I find like a recording of this presentation or just the links to your PowerPoint?
Yeah, so I will have both this recording of this presentation and the FLMA webinar on the FLAP webpage probably in the next day or so. So you'll be able to see a video recording and slide decks of both. So if you have the link, I can drop it in the chat here. Should be available in the next day or so.
Great, thank you.
That can't be it. Anybody else? Looks like, yeah, Eric, go ahead.
Yeah, if the New Mexico Department of Transportation has wholesale jurisdiction over a particular access, my assumption would be they would be required to be the primary applicant, or could the county be the primary?
Yeah, if it's owned and maintained by the state DOT, they would need to be the primary, unless the county is looking to, you know, assume
Yeah,
possession or something like
right.
that, right? Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, no, thank you. Yeah, that's helpful.
Yep.
And I just add that, I mean, the county can prepare the application or do all that, but then it does need to come from the state as the applicant, but they might, you know, be more likely to be on board if there's support with the process.
Yeah, we did that with an application in 2018 with the
Mhm.
DOT. So I have a little bit, it's been a few years, but yeah.
Yeah. Well, don't hesitate to reach out to Andrew if you have questions.
Will do, thanks.
Thanks, Jill. Anybody else? All right. Well, I guess we can break then. Thanks everybody. And you know, again, just feel free to reach out to me or Jill at any time during the process, and happy to walk through kind of the details of your project on a case by case basis if you'd like to do some follow up. And yeah, we're all looking forward to some great projects here in New Mexico for this year. So thanks everybody.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank
Yeah, you
you.
bet.
Thank you.
Thanks, Andrew.